The Book That Wrote Itself. Chapter 1. The Ink Awakens. It was a rainy afternoon when the book first appeared. No one could explain how it came to be, nor where it had come from. It simply sat there on the desk, resting against the dusty lamp, as though it had always belonged there. The room felt heavier, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of something ancient and inexplicable. The protagonist, Elena, was an ordinary young woman, with an ordinary life filled with work, family, and a slight sense of dissatisfaction with the mundane nature of her days. She had no idea that this rainy afternoon would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in her life. She noticed the book as she walked into her study. It was unlike any book she had ever seen, bound in dark leather with no title on the spine, no label to indicate its origins. Its pages were strangely pristine, almost glowing under the dim light. Elena was drawn to it without understanding why. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out and picked it up, feeling an odd chill spread through her fingertips, as though the book itself were alive, pulsing with energy. Curiosity tugged at her, but there was a gnawing sense of unease in her chest. She hadn't planned on reading, yet the book seemed to beckon her. The air around her grew colder, and she heard the faintest of whispers, a sound too soft to be real, but unmistakable nonetheless. Elena shook it off as nothing more than the wind, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Opening the first page, Elena was surprised to find that it was blank. At first, she thought it was a strange novelty, some sort of experimental art piece, but as her gaze drifted across the page, something inexplicable happened. The ink began to appear, line by line, slowly and deliberately, as if the words were being written before her very eyes. Elena blinked in disbelief. The words seemed to form themselves without her having to lift a finger. The ink danced across the page, weaving together sentences in elegant flowing script. It was as though the book itself was alive, telling its story as it went along, guided by an invisible hand. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. The first line appeared before her eyes. "This is not the beginning, but the middle of a story that has no end." Elena's heart raced. The book wasn't just writing itself, it was writing about her. She flipped to the next page, the pages turning with an ease that felt almost too smooth, as if the book were eager to reveal its secrets. More ink appeared, forming a strange paragraph that made no sense to her at first, but the deeper she read, the more it seemed to pull her in. The words spoke of a world, her world, and described things she hadn't told anyone, details of her own life that no one could have known. The sentences unfolded like a map of her memories. A moment of her childhood, the way the wind had smelled the day she'd met her first love. The secret fear that had always hovered in the back of her mind, that she would never be enough. Everything was there, written in ink that was still wet and fresh, as though it had been written just for her. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. How could it know these things? How could this book know her deepest thoughts, her forgotten memories? The sensation of being watched grew stronger. She glanced around the room, half expecting to find someone standing there, someone who had been watching her the whole time. But the room was empty, save for the soft sound of the rain tapping against the window. With each turn of the page, the book revealed more. It spoke of the future, of events that hadn't yet happened, decisions she would make, paths she would walk. The writing flowed seamlessly, predicting the moments that lay ahead with an uncanny accuracy. And the worst part, it seemed to know her choices before she did, as if the book was writing the story she was destined to live. But it was more than just an eerie coincidence. The book was alive, and it wasn't just observing her life, it was controlling it. It wasn't long before the first inkling of doubt crept into her mind. Was this book simply a collection of words and thoughts that happened to coincide with her life? Or was it something more sinister? Was it manipulating her, pushing her toward a destiny that had already been written long before she even picked it up? Her hand shook as she turned to another page, and the ink continued to materialize, this time describing something terrifying. It described her death. It spoke in chilling detail about the moment she would fall, the place where her life would end. It didn't explain how, but the certainty in the words made her stomach twist with dread. The ink was no longer just a passive observer. It was shaping her future, shaping her life. Elena slammed the book shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The rain outside was louder now, as if it had joined in her anxiety, a relentless drumming against the windows. She stood there, frozen, not sure whether to be terrified or awed by what had just happened. The book was alive, and it was writing her story. But the question gnawed at her mind. If the book was writing her future, could she rewrite it? Or was she merely a character in a tale that had already been decided long before she ever opened its cover? And with that, the story had truly begun. Chapter 2. A Story Begins. The next day, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the book. She had set it aside after her disturbing experience, but the memory of its ink, the way it wrote itself, haunted her. She knew she should have stayed away from it, locked it away and forgotten all about it. But she couldn't. It was as though the book had become a part of her, pulling at her thoughts, urging her to return. As soon as she stepped into her study that morning, the book was there, waiting for her. It sat innocently on the desk, looking like just another book, but Elena knew better now. She hesitated for a moment, the dread from yesterday still lingering. But then, a strange sense of inevitability washed over her. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. The book was calling to her. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the desk and picked it up once more. Her fingers brushed against the cover, and the chill from yesterday crept up her spine again. The book felt heavier today, as though it had absorbed something during the night. She opened it, half expecting the ink to appear as it had before, but this time the pages were blank. The book had paused, it seemed, as if waiting for her to continue the story. For a moment, Elena felt a sense of relief. Perhaps it had been a one-time occurrence, something her mind had conjured in a moment of paranoia. But the silence in the room was deafening. The book remained still, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to do something, anything. She stared at the blank page in front of her, but soon a strange feeling crept over her. The room seemed to grow warmer, and the air grew thicker, almost as if the walls themselves were closing in. She could hear her heartbeat, pounding in her ears, and the distant sound of her breath. But then something changed. The ink slowly began to appear once again, like the softest whisper at first, gradually growing louder. The words began to form, delicate and deliberate, right before her eyes. "You have chosen to continue," they read. "Now the story begins in earnest." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The book was acknowledging her. It wasn't just writing about her life. It was responding to her choices, shaping her actions. The words continued to spill onto the page, but now, they didn't just describe what was happening. They began to dictate her actions. "Turn the page," the book instructed in its cool, fluid script. Elena's hands trembled, but she obeyed. As she turned the page, she noticed that the ink seemed to move more swiftly now, as though the book had grown impatient. The next set of words appeared. "The first step has been taken. You have opened the door. What you choose next will set the course for what is to come." Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. What door? What choice? She hadn't chosen anything yet, had she? The more she read, the more she realized that the book was telling her exactly what to do, what path to follow. It wasn't simply recounting events from her past, it was shaping the very fabric of her future. And the more she read, the more she wondered if she was truly in control at all. Her mind raced as she turned another page, desperate to understand. But the book seemed to move faster now, its ink flowing like a stream, pushing her along. It was as if she were being swept away by a current, and the book was the tide, guiding her without asking for her consent. The next lines formed. "Go to the place you fear most. There you will find the next piece of the puzzle. Do not resist. Trust the story." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The words sent a jolt of panic through her chest. There was only one place she feared above all others, the old library on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, its darkened windows casting shadows that seemed to whisper of forgotten knowledge. No one dared to go there anymore, and Elena had avoided it ever since she was a child. The place held memories she wasn't ready to face, memories of a time when she had lost someone close to her. But here, in the quiet of her study, the book had just given her an ultimatum. She had to go. The ink seemed to swirl on the page, almost as if it were urging her on. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest, but her hands moved as though they had a mind of their own. The book was in control. Elena knew she had no choice but to follow its instructions. She had been drawn into a story she couldn't escape, a story that had already begun, and one that would lead her down a path she couldn't foresee. She closed the book with a soft snap and stared at it, her heart pounding. She knew what she had to do. She had to go to the library to face whatever lay within its decaying walls. But as she moved toward the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the book was not done with her yet. It had begun writing her story, but how would it end? Was she simply a character, helpless in the hands of fate, or could she find a way to break free? The door to her study creaked as she opened it, stepping into the world outside. The world the book had just begun to reshape. Chapter 3. Pages of Paradox. Elena stood at the threshold of the old library, her heart hammering in her chest. The air around her was damp and thick, and the once majestic building now stood before her in a state of decay. Its stone walls worn with age, the wooden door sagging on its hinges. It was the kind of place that felt wrong the moment you stepped into its shadow, and yet There she was, unable to turn away. The book's words had drawn her here, and she could feel its presence in the back of her mind, urging her to enter. For a moment, Elena hesitated. The library was a place from her past, a place of forgotten memories and regrets. It was where she had spent countless hours as a child, curled up in the corners reading stories of adventure and fantasy. But it was also the place where she had learned about loss, where she had first encountered the unexplainable. The library's darkened halls held secrets, ones she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But the book had made its demands clear. She had to come here. She had no choice but to follow its instructions. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself, and pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty, cavernous space inside. As she stepped in, the familiar scent of dust and old paper filled her nostrils. The air felt stagnant, as if the library hadn't been disturbed in years. Yet something was different. There was a sense of movement here, a subtle shift that sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't alone. The dim light from the tall, arched windows cast long shadows across the room, and the shelves, once filled with the treasures of knowledge, now stood bare. Yet, in the center of the room there was one thing that remained untouched. A single ancient book resting on a pedestal, its cover worn and tattered. Elena felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though it were calling to her, waiting for her to approach. With trembling hands she stepped closer, each footfall echoing through the silent space. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and frayed, but the ink on the cover was still legible. The Book of Paradoxes. The title seemed to shimmer in the faint light, almost as if the letters were alive, shifting in shape and meaning. Elena reached out and, despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back, opened the book. As she flipped the first page, a strange feeling washed over her. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls bending and twisting in a way that defied logic. The ink on the page began to shift, the words rearranging themselves before her eyes, forming sentences that didn't make sense. At least, not in the way she had expected. They read, "Here begins the tale that ends where it began, but the ending was never meant to be." Elena blinked in confusion. She tried to make sense of the words, but they slipped away from her grasp as if the book itself was playing with her mind. She turned the page, desperate to find something concrete, something that made sense. The ink began to flow faster now, the words forming new phrases that twisted time and space in ways she couldn't comprehend. Now you are here, but you were never supposed to be. The past and the future have become one, and you are caught between them. Turn the page and you will see. Elena's hands shook as she flipped another page, her heart racing. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. The very space around her seemed to stretch and contract, like she was standing in a place that wasn't quite real. She read the next lines. "You have entered the paradox. The more you seek answers, the less you will find. For the truth is not what you think it is. What was once known has become forgotten, and what is yet to come is already lost." The book had no answers, only more riddles. Elena slammed the book shut, a gasp escaping her lips. The room seemed to return to its natural state, the walls no longer warping and twisting. but the sense of unease remained, gnawing at her thoughts. The book wasn't just a record of events, it was rewriting reality itself. The words she had just read had made no sense, yet they had planted seeds of doubt in her mind. How could she be in the present if the book was telling her she was lost between past and future? What was real, and what was merely a construct of the story? Elena felt as though she was no longer in control of her own existence, as if the book had the power to manipulate the world around her. She had known deep down that there was something wrong with the book, but now she was beginning to realize just how far its reach went. The rules of time, space, and even her own identity were being rewritten with each turn of the page. Elena had entered a world where nothing was fixed, where everything could change in an instant. She was caught in a web of paradoxes, unable to escape. Every step she took led her deeper into a maze of uncertainty, a maze that had no clear exit. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. She wasn't just reading a story, she was living it. The book was not just telling her a tale, it was guiding her through a world that shifted with every new word. Elena could feel herself unraveling, as if the very fabric of her reality was beginning to dissolve. The future was unclear, the past distorted. And yet, somewhere in the swirling chaos, Elena knew one thing for certain. The answers she sought weren't in the book. The book wasn't just a guide, it was the cause of her confusion. She had to stop reading, to break free from its grip. But how could she when it seemed to control everything around her? With a deep breath, Elena closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. She had to regain control, to find a way to stop the cycle of paradox. She wasn't just a character in a story, she was more than that. She had to believe that. She had to believe that she could rewrite the story. The question was, where would she begin? Chapter 4. Unwritten Realities. Elena had returned to her apartment, the weight of the Book of Paradoxes still lingering in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. The ancient pages, with their twisting words and cryptic riddles, had left her unsettled in ways she couldn't quite explain. She had spent the night tossing and turning, unable to escape the overwhelming feeling that her world was no longer entirely her own. The line between what was real and what was written had blurred beyond recognition, and she had no idea how to restore the balance. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through her windows, Elena found herself standing in front of her desk once more, staring at the blank page before her. Her hand hovered over the paper, but she couldn't bring herself to write anything. The idea of putting pen to paper felt wrong now, like adding words to an already too well-written story. A story that wasn't just unfolding on the page, but in her very life. She had never been superstitious, never believed in the paranormal or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. But the events of the past few days, everything that had happened since she opened that cursed book, had thrown her entire understanding of reality into question. The ink that had appeared before her eyes, the strange pull to return to the library, the shifting of time and space, it all pointed to something far beyond her control. Taking a deep breath, Elena finally sat down and opened the book once again. The pages were still blank, but as soon as her fingers brushed the surface of the first page, the ink began to flow. words forming before her eyes, just as they had before. But this time there was something different. The ink didn't just form words, it shifted, as if the book itself was alive, aware of her presence, of her every thought. The first sentence appeared on the page. Reality is a fragile thing. It bends and warps with every choice you make, each action, each word, leaving its mark on the world. Elena frowned, reading the words over and over. She had always understood reality as something stable, something tangible, but this was something entirely different. The idea that reality could bend with each choice, each word, was both terrifying and exhilarating. Was that what had been happening to her? Had her every decision led her into this strange web of paradoxes? Had she written herself into this story? She continued reading, unable to stop herself. But some realities are unwritten. They exist on the edge of what is known, waiting for the right moment to be brought to life. And you, Elena, have crossed that threshold. The world you know is one of many, and the truth lies not in what is written, but in what remains unsaid. Her pulse quickened. The ink, as if understanding her confusion, continued its fluid motion, forming new lines. Your reality is not fixed. It is a thread in a tapestry of possibilities, each moment leading you to a different future. But you are not the only one who holds the pen. There are others, writers, who shape the fabric of existence with their choices. And soon you will learn how far the stories reach. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at the words, her mind racing. The book had just told her that reality itself was not a single, static entity. It was a web of endless possibilities, each one unfolding depending on the choices she made. But it also suggested that there were other forces at play, other writers out there, shaping the world with their decisions, just as she had been unknowingly shaping her own fate. This wasn't just some strange fantasy. This was something much darker, something much more real. The ink had not just recorded her life. It had been guiding it, nudging her along a path she hadn't chosen, making her part of a story far larger than herself. She had become a character in someone else's narrative. Her heart thudded in her chest. Who were these writers? What did they want from her? The book spoke of unwritten realities, of stories that existed on the edge of perception. But how was Elena supposed to navigate them? How could she tell what was real anymore? The words on the pages were no longer just warnings. They were instructions, guidelines for a new reality, a new way of being, one that she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The more she thought about it, the more Elena realized how powerless she truly was. She had opened the book and stepped into its world willingly, but now it felt as though she was trapped in a cycle, one that was being written around her, with her as both the protagonist and the pawn. She wanted to rebel, to refuse the book's demands, but every instinct told her that she couldn't. The book had already rewritten her reality, and now it was rewriting everything else. She stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. She had to stop this. She had to find a way to break free of the book's influence before it was too late. But as she turned to face the desk once more, she noticed something unsettling. The words on the page had shifted again. They no longer spoke of reality in abstract terms. They were speaking directly to her, as though the book knew her thoughts, knew her every fear. You are questioning the story. But the story will not question you. It will pull you deeper into the unwritten realms where nothing is certain, where all things are possible. The ink flowed faster now, swirling with a force Elena couldn't ignore. It wasn't just guiding her anymore, it was demanding something, and for the first time Elena understood. The book wasn't merely telling her what to do, it was creating the world around her, shaping the future with every word, every paragraph. Her hands reached out to close the book, but before she could do so, the last words appeared, glowing slightly on the page. "You have crossed the line, Elena. There is no turning back now." Her stomach dropped. No turning back. She had already made the choice, and now there was no way to undo it. Elena was caught in a web of unwritten realities, a world where every decision had consequences far beyond what she could understand. The lines between fiction and reality had blurred beyond repair, and now she would have to face the truth of what she had become, a character in a story she could neither control nor escape. As the room darkened around her, Elena could feel it, an invisible force closing in, shaping her world, guiding her steps. The story was no longer just something she read, it was something she was living. And she had no idea what the next page would bring. Chapter 5: The Author's Touch. Elena's world felt as though it were being slowly suffocated by a force she could neither see nor understand. The book, once just an object of curiosity, had become something far more insidious, a presence in her life that she couldn't escape. The words that had once appeared on the pages now seemed to echo in her thoughts, their meaning shifting and distorting with every passing second. She no longer knew where her thoughts ended and the book's words began. It had become part of her, a weight pressing down on her chest, a voice whispering through the corners of her mind. The room around her seemed to hum with an electric charge, the air thick and heavy with anticipation. It was as though everything was waiting for something to happen. The words in the book were no longer abstract or distant. They had taken on a more personal tone, addressing her directly, speaking to her like an old friend, or perhaps more disturbingly, like a puppet master. Elena sat at her desk, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the pages. She had tried to fight it, to close the book, to shut the words out of her mind, but she couldn't. The more she tried to ignore it, the louder the book's call became. It was as if it were woven into the very fabric of her thoughts, demanding attention, compelling her to listen. She was no longer reading it. The book was reading her. With a deep breath, she finally opened it once more, the familiar rustle of the pages filling the room. She flipped through the first few sections, scanning the lines for something she could understand, something that would make sense of the chaos in her mind. But once again, the ink began to flow, forming words that were as mysterious and cryptic as before. "Your story has begun, Elena, but it has only just begun. You are the protagonist, but not the only one. The author's hand guides all." The words shimmered on the page, glowing faintly, as if they were alive. Elena stared at them, trying to make sense of what she was reading. The author's hand. What did that mean? Was she just a character in someone else's story? And who or what was this author that controlled everything? The book's ink continued to pulse and shift, as though it was alive, breathing, responding to her confusion. Elena's breath hitched as she read further. The author writes not only the path, but the very essence of the journey. You are a creation, Elena, born from the thoughts of someone who holds the power of creation itself. They shape you, mold you, make you bend to their will. And yet, you are more than just a character. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickened, the words on the page becoming sharper, more insistent. It was as though the book could sense her fear, her uncertainty, and was feeding off it, growing stronger with each passing second. You see, Elena, the next words appeared almost as if they were written in bold black ink. You are both the creator and the creation. In this story, there is no clear line between the two. The author may write, but you will choose how it ends. That is your power, your gift, and your curse. She had always believed herself to be the one in control of her life, the one who made decisions, who steered her own fate. But now, the more she read, the more she realized how naive she had been. The idea of an author who held dominion over her world had shaken her to the core. Was she just a puppet? Was everything she had ever experienced, every choice she had ever made, merely part of someone else's plan? The ink began to shift again, the letters now forming into a strange, swirling pattern that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, like a heartbeat echoing in the stillness of the room. Elena watched in both awe and horror as the words continued to dance before her. But the author cannot control all, Elena. Not everything is written in stone. There are gaps, cracks in the narrative, places where reality bends and breaks. The choices you make can change the world. You must find those cracks. They are your escape, and if you learn to see them, you will unlock the power to write your own story. Elena's head spun with the realization. There were cracks in the narrative. She wasn't entirely bound by the book's author. She had the power to change things, to break free from the story that had been forced upon her. The idea both terrified and exhilarated her. If she could find these cracks, these moments where the story could be bent or even broken, she could regain control. But how? Her eyes darted across the pages, seeking out any hint, any clue that could lead her to these fractures in the world. As she turned the pages, she felt as though the book was leading her, coaxing her forward, urging her to follow its path. The more she read, the clearer it became. This was not just a book. This was a portal, a gateway to a reality that could be shaped, manipulated, and rewritten. And she was not only a part of it, she was central to it. She was the one who could alter the course of her story. But Elena knew that gaining this power would not come without consequences. The book had warned her it was both a gift and a curse. The more she delved into its secrets, the more she could feel herself slipping further from the world she had once known. The line between reality and fiction was blurring with every page she turned. The air in the room grew heavier, more charged, as Elena's gaze met the final words written on the page. You can choose, Elena, but know this: the author's hand is always present, and there is always a cost. Choose wisely. Elena closed the book slowly, the weight of its message sinking in. She had power, but it came at a price. The author was not just some distant, invisible figure. He or she was always there, watching, guiding, shaping. Elena realized that she was not just a character in a story. She was a battleground, a place where two forces, her will and the author's, fought for control of her future. She had come to a crossroads. The power to change the narrative was in her hands, but so was the knowledge that once she took that step, there would be no turning back. The question was, would she dare to rewrite the story, to challenge the author's control? Or would she remain a puppet, trapped within the lines that had been drawn for her? Her answer was clear, but the consequences were still unknown. As the book lay closed in her hands, Elena took a deep breath. The author's touch was powerful, but it was her story now. She would write it,